Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Maryland primary results from Tuesday night's primary elections. We'll take a look at both the Republican and Democratic primaries and kind of see where each party is headed going ahead into the midterm elections, as well as the overall state of the race in the Maryland governor's election. So we'll take a look at all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So first off, we'll start off with the Republican primary since we already have a winner. Dan Cox, who is a member of the House of Delegates out of Frederick County, has won so far with 16.2% of the vote. To Kelly Schulz is just 40.2%. Now, this is a pretty surprising outcome in so being that the margin is so large for Dan Cox at this rate. Now, the mail-in ballots don't get counted until today. I don't think any of those counts have been updated as of yet. So once the mail-ins come in, the margin might narrow up, but nonetheless, Dan Cox has enough of the vote to be declared the winner of the Republican primary. And, you know, he was the Trump-endorsed pick, so obviously the biggest takeaway right off the bat is that Donald Trump is still the kingmaker in the Republican Party. He wants to run for president in 2024. That's nearly certain. Whether he runs or not is still up in the air, although I think, if you were to ask me, I think there's about a 90% chance that Donald Trump does run in 2024. You know, all the evidence indicates to that so far. But Dan Cox winning is really interesting in Maryland because Kelly Schulz was in the administration of Larry Hogan, who is the popular governor in the state of Maryland, a Republican governor, only the second Republican governor in Maryland history to be reelected. And, you know, despite him being popular, as we talked about in the previous video on the Maryland primary, he's not popular among Republicans in the state of Maryland. I think his approval rating among Republicans is only in the 50s or something like that. And there's a huge segment of the Republican base that doesn't like Larry Hogan, mainly because of his criticism of President Trump, as well as his COVID restrictions that were imposed back in 2020 and 2021 that shut down a lot of businesses and ultimately angered the conservative base of the Republican Party. So Kelly Schulz probably would have won this primary if Trump hadn't intervened in it. Obviously, I think Dan Cox could have made it close, but Kelly Schulz did have a large money advantage. The only problem for her is that she didn't really do a whole lot with it. She did run some ads and do a couple of campaign stops, but Dan Cox did have a much better campaign overall, a much more grassroots campaign, especially in Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore, where, you know, he essentially dominated. You know, Western Maryland was pretty much given since this is Trump country. You know, Western Maryland has a lot more in common with West Virginia or the South than the, you know, mid-Atlantic where it's from. But, you know, his strong showing wasn't just in these strongly conservative areas, but it was also in Prince George's County, Montgomery County. These are extremely liberal counties. Now, obviously, the Republican bases of those counties don't necessarily have to be liberal, but usually in other states, you tend to have more of the urban counties support the more moderate Republican candidates for the nomination. But, you know, Dan Cox did well pretty much everywhere. Kelly Schulz lost places like Frederick County, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County. You know, these are pretty important counties in the general election to kind of determine, you know, what margin the candidates are likely to get. And ultimately, I thought she was going to do better. I thought she would win Anne Arundel County. Maybe she will after the mail-ins come in, but I doubt it at this rate. You know, I thought she'd probably win Frederick, maybe, since I think both candidates are actually from Frederick. I'm not sure. She might be from Anne Arundel. I could be messing this up, but either way, a pretty resounding victory for Dan Cox. Even when the mail-in ballots do come in and the race probably does narrow up a bit, I still expect him to win this primary by a pretty considerable margin. And ultimately, that could be thanks down to his grassroots support, you know, Hogan's unpopularity with the Republican base, and of course, the Trump endorsement itself. So, you know, all really big factors in a Maryland Republican primary. Now, Maryland actually went pretty big to Donald Trump back in the 2016 primary. He got like 54% of the vote in the state. And I think the next runner-up was Ted Cruz at only, might have been Ted Cruz or John Kasich at like 20-something%. So, you know, he won, Donald Trump won every single county in the state of Maryland, and Dan Cox basically won almost every county in the state of Maryland. So it's not really surprising. The Maryland GOP base is very conservative, unlike the GOP bases of, say, Vermont or Massachusetts, which their party establishments tend to prop up much more liberal candidates. Maryland is not the same way. You know, Larry Hogan won back in 2014 in a much less polarizing environment than we see today. But, you know, that's really the Maryland primary in a nutshell for the GOP. We'll take a look now at the Democratic primary, which is still undecided. And, you know, it is really interesting because there's a lot more mail-in ballots for the Democratic primary, which makes sense. A lot more Democratic voters vote by mail. But basically all of these candidates, at least the top three, have been saying that they're favored in the mail-in ballots and they're expecting, a victory when they all get counted. But I still think Wes Moore, he has an advantage right now. Tom Perez, obviously, is the former chair of the DNC. He has huge name recognition nationwide. He's also from Maryland. He's from Montgomery County, which explains why he won it by such a large margin. But, I expected Peter Franco to do better than he did. He did well in the Eastern Shore and Western Maryland. He is the more conservative, moderate Democrat, pro-business Democrat. And he's also a very popular statewide official. He won almost every county back in 2018, if we take a look. He's been comptroller of the state of Maryland for a really long time. And it shows, he got 71% of the vote. So he's popular across the board. But among the Democratic base, they were clearly looking for somebody a lot more progressive, a lot more left-wing. And that's one of the reasons why Wes Moore currently is leading the Democratic primary. Now, only 58% of the vote is in, so that lead, could change. I really don't see a path for Peter Franco at this point. He's down with only 74,000 votes on Election Day voting. Tom Perez could theoretically win this, maybe, if he's favored in the mail-ins. But I think it's more likely that Wes Moore becomes the Democratic nominee in Maryland. And he is somebody who used to be a more blue dog Democrat, but has since sort of shifted much more to the left during his primary campaign, and probably will in the general election, since his opponent is Dan Cox and not somebody like Kelly Schulz. Kelly Schulz is basically a Hogan acolyte. She worked in the Hogan administration. She's a much more moderate Republican, more focused on economic and kitchen table issues, which you really have to be in a state like Maryland, which voted for Joe Biden by 33 points. So, she was running a much more Hogan-esque campaign. Dan Cox obviously running a very Trumpian campaign. He might tact a bit to the center toward the general election, but I don't think that's really going to help him get anywhere close to winning when it's all said and done. But, Wes Moore, it really is up in the air as to whether or not he's going to continue to run as a progressive Democrat in the general. I think he probably will, since he really doesn't have much to lose anyway. Dan Cox is not a viable general election candidate. And, that's another thing I didn't talk about too much. But, a lot of this Republican primary was down to electability. Kelly Schulz was somebody that, if she advanced to the general election, would have had a shot at winning, especially against somebody like Wes Moore, who, is a more progressive Democrat, has been rejected by Maryland in the past. We saw that in 2018 with Larry Hogan's landslide victory over Ben Jealous, despite it being a blue wave year. Ben Jealous was a very progressive Democrat, supported universal health care, was a friend of Bernie Sanders. So, this result kind of shows you that in Maryland, with the right Republican, they will choose the Republican over the progressive Democrat, because Larry Hogan really was a very inoffensive Republican. He was focused on business issues, didn't really get involved at all in the hot button cultural issues, said that was kind of beneath him in the office and all that stuff. So that's one of the reasons why he won by such a large margin, because the Maryland electorate overall is center left. It's not really far left or progressive, and that's why Larry Hogan won by the margin he did. Also, his high approval rating certainly helped him in that regard. But going back to the general election, Wes Moore will easily win, even if he is a more progressive Democrat. Tom Perez, again, it really is unclear who's going to come out on top. I think it's likely to be Wes Moore just because he already has the lead. We still have a lot of mail-in ballots to count, but if this lead does hold, especially in the Baltimore area, Prince George's County area, this sort of central part of the state of Maryland, Tom Perez will do well in Montgomery County, and, I guess Frederick as well, although I could see Wes Moore even edging him out there as well. But ultimately, I think either one of these candidates is a safe bet in the general election, and Maryland, again, is a safe Democratic state. The only thing that could have changed that, in my opinion, was Kelly Schulz winning the nomination. She was a Hogan-esque Republican, and during a red wave year in an open seat, it's possible that she could have won. Now, I've heard she didn't really have the best ground game in the primary. She wasn't campaigning as much as she should have. And, obviously, if you're going to be a Republican winning in the state of Maryland, you have to be, knocking doors essentially every day, doing rallies, making phone calls. A Democrat has a much more assured path to victory. In fact, in safe blue states, Democrats are the default to win unless, other circumstances present themselves that would otherwise hurt the Democrat or help the Republican. But ultimately, this is going to be a safety race for the Democrats. The highest margin I could see Dan Cox is getting is maybe getting it within 25 points. I think the highest he gets, his ceiling, is probably about 38% of the vote. I don't really see him cracking even 40. Maybe if he's able to win Anne Arundel County, but given the fact that he is a much more right-leaning Republican, I don't really see that being the case anymore. Anne Arundel County and the Annapolis area overall were historically Republican, but, are very moderate voters and have, trended away from the GOP in a massive fashion over the last 4 years. So ultimately, I don't really think Dan Cox can even crack 40. Even in a red wave year, I think he gets about 38% of the vote when all's said and done. And, that's really probably the last time we'll talk about Maryland unless there's some major development throughout the midterm cycle. But overall, a seat that Democrats really won't have to worry about in November. It's just a question now of who is going to be the Democratic nominee. Once that's sorted out, we go right into general election season. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a like down below if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.